We're very happy to have Edinburgh's own Henry S. Thompson. So Henry Thompson is a professor of web informatics here at the University of Edinburgh School of Informatics. He studied computer science and linguistics at the University of California, Berkeley, while working at Xerox PARC near Stanford. So taking up the entire Bay Area. Broad interests include computational linguistics, natural language processing, the architecture of the web, the foundations of cognitive science. His bio includes an awful lot of stuff about XML, which meant nothing to me whatsoever.
And it's totally irrelevant to what I'm doing here today.
About today.
Exactly.
Thank you very much, Henry.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. To which I think the usual response is, well, thank you for being had. So this is sort of out in left field. And I'm not a moral philosopher, although I spent a lot of time hanging out with various philosophers while I was in the Bay Area. Mostly I'm a practitioner, but I'm a practitioner with a lot of interest in the foundations of my science. And I'm also a parent. And my interest in this question really derives from being the father of 3 children, all of whom went through teenage. And in the course of doing so, I'm not doing this. So if you are, and it doesn't work for the camera, you might want to change it.
Wait, is it like on a timer?
Just turn it back on again. Yeah.
Oh, wait a minute, okay.
Right. I mean, not that I care desperately about whether I make it on the camera or not. Those of you who have children will know that computer games are part of the modern world, and my children, I'm just young enough that my children are just old enough that they came up through between the 3 of them, almost the whole trajectory of the creation of the modern gaming universe. And my now 28-year-old son, James, is actually, if he could, he would make a living in games journalism. Nobody can make a living in games journalism, as far as I can tell, so he's doing other things. But I do owe a great deal to his thoughtful consideration of his obsession with computer games, and in particular with the game that I'm going to focus on by the time I get to the second half of this talk. I'm also very grateful to a former member of the Edinburgh community, Joanna Bryson, who's now professor down in Bath, for clarifying the agent-patient distinction, although that thank you is there from the first time I gave this talk several years ago, and I can't now understand how anybody could be confused about the agent-patient distinction, but evidently I was. So, artificial persons. We are in the business as human beings of making sense of the world we live in, and in particular of making sense to the other actors in it. But talking about the human condition is a bit like trying to explain water to a fish in the famous metaphor. My day job as a cognitive scientist, which is about half of what I do these days, is about the computational tool as a vehicle for understanding human beings. So not just doing it bigger and faster, right? But also by using computers as models. Or a computational linguist might do that by building models of language use. I'm going to try to actually explore some aspects of personhood, which is a much harder thing to put salt on the tail of, I suppose, by actually looking at existing computer systems. In particular, at computer systems in which virtual agents engage in sometimes pretty extreme violence, and asking whether playing computer games, a particular kind of violent computer game, is in some way inhumane. And the pun is intentional, or the calling attention to the pun that's implicit in the word inhumane is intentional, because my ultimate purpose here is just trying to understand a little better what it means to be human. And somewhat surprisingly, perhaps, looking at this question of computer games turns out to be yet another way of coming at that question. Well, you know, this is not an area that I'm hugely expert at, and therefore I'm going to go over this very quickly, and probably most of you know most of what I'm going to say here. But there are an enormous number of computer games out there. They range hugely in terms of type. It's a space that's moving too fast to keep up with unless you try to do it as a métier, which I don't. Not surprisingly, we start out in inheriting games from the pre-computational era and producing analogs of those in the computational space. So strategy games, puzzle games, games of chance, and so on and so forth. All right? And then the medium has allowed us to come up with a wide range of new kinds of games, which are growing and morphing all the time. Simulations, SimCity, I'm showing my age, Tetris and its descendants, likewise. I seem to be stuck on 2 dots at the moment. For those of you who have mobile phones, you'll know what 2 dots is. Never played Angry Birds, but most of my family do. The simplest of childhood games has turned into one of the most controversial areas of computer gaming, namely, broadly speaking, the goodies versus the baddies, right? And I won't indulge in ethnic stereotypes here, but you know what I mean. And they've come a long way from, well, I grew up in the States, so I should honestly say the backyard, but we're in Scotland, so the back green, all right? Computational combat is a hugely ramified and complex space, and I'm nothing like a sufficiently full-time student of this to be able to lay it out in any detail, but for my purposes, there's one variety that stands out, known as first-person shooters. And you can start doing science on this, or at least analysis, and say, well, what is the basis on which Henry says this is different from all, you know, interestingly different from other games? So there are some dimensions along which the difference is apparent. There are lots of beings involved, as opposed to, say, 1 when you're playing chess, or 2 when you're playing Pong, right? Showing my age again, right? On the other hand, the number of actual human beings involved is 1 in the sort of heartland cases that I'm concerned with here anyway, as opposed to 2, Pong, arcade games in general, many, 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 massively, perhaps, multiplayer online role-playing games, which huge space, or half a dozen in 2 teams in arenas, right? You can go to a big basketball arena in many major cities around the world and watch a dozen, almost all men, in groups of 6, typically, play in front of you on a screen the size of this room, a multiplayer war game. And there are leagues, and people make money at this, right? It's an enormous industry, which anybody in this room involved with? Probably not. But it's a big deal, all right? But not what I'm going to talk about today. The perspective is crucially first person. The world that the player sees is the world as seen through the eyes of an actor, an agent, a human, but not mostly humans. And this ramifies in subclasses, and I can't keep up with it, and it doesn't matter for my purposes. Because these are typically narrative games. They're games with a narrative structure. There's some notion of a mission, a goal that you have been set, that you've taken on board by playing the game at all, within the game world, and it typically takes hours and repeated attempts to achieve. You try, you fail, you go back to the beginning, you try again, you do something different, and so on and so forth, and it engages you and draws you in and keeps you in the game world for long periods of time, especially if you're a post-adolescent male. The player controls movements and actions of their character in the game world and experiences the game world in the first person. There are, however, to make life interesting, typically lots of non-player characters, other agents in the world that you're inhabiting and playing in. They may be human or human-like in appearance, at least, robotic, animal, alien, whatever. They may be of great importance, and a few of them, and you interact with them all the time, or they may come and go in crowds and so on. They may be working with you, they may be working against you, they may be indifferent. They're all, although the illusion is of independence, they're all, of course, controlled by the game's intelligence. This is a one-person activity. One of the things that's interesting about this is that the player is not always in control. You might think of this as being something where you're manipulating your avatar or your player. But in fact, one of the characteristics of FPSs, which grew up organically, I haven't actually seen very much comment about this. It has become, it seems just obvious that this is the way it has to be. But in fact, in most FPSs, certainly the ones that I'm talking about here, gameplay alternates between episodes when you're driving, you're moving your character around, doing things, typically shooting at people, hiding from other people who are shooting at you, all the rest of that, right, on the one hand, and episodes where the action is entirely computer generated and your controls are effectively dead. For historical reasons that I don't actually know, I can't actually do the historical morphology here, these are known as cutscenes, where you're essentially watching a movie in which your character is one of the players. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples. Don't panic. I'm not going to show any examples of significant violence in real FPS gameplay. I don't have the technological skill to capture them anyway. And I really don't want to. And maybe there's a whole discussion to be had about that, but not here. But I am going to show you a couple of extracts from one historical, one contemporary game, just to give you a sense of what it is that I'm talking about here. Typically, near the beginning, there's going to be a relatively benign cutscene in which the game world is introduced, some of the characters, and the controls by which the character is driven around the place. And the first thing I'm going to show is something from quite a recent, I realize I didn't make any attempt to get the audio working. And I don't even see an audio jack. Yeah, it should go through. We'll see. I mean, it doesn't matter whether you can hear it or not. This is from a relatively recent game, Battlefield 4, dating back a few years, but not more. Yeah, it's coming from this speaker. I could probably fix it, but it doesn't really matter. And yeah, it's dark. It's supposed to be dark. So you see the first-person perspective. You're looking at the world, as it were, through this character's eyes. Right? And you're getting feedback from the notional world. You're getting instructions about how to use the controls overlaid up there in the upper right-hand corner. Doesn't matter that you can't read them. Don't worry about that. Let's just get a feel for this. All right. This is, as I said, a fairly recent one, so the video quality is quite high. It's a complicated visual environment, physical environment that your character is navigating. You will have to take over the navigation once we get out of the cutscene. That kind of surprise generates adrenaline.
He's up, Pat.
All right. So that's an example of, as I said, a fairly recent one. That's known as a training episode in which you're being introduced to the controls and the basic style of the game. But there's also sort of an introduction to the narrative, which typically also comes near the beginning, obviously, in which you get introduced to the main character and the other non-player characters, and the mission, whatever it is that you have to learn, what it is that you're supposed to do How do you play this game? What's the goal? What does it mean to win, if you will, and to get the narrative started? So here's part of the cutscene from a game which is sort of a classic, I guess. Halo, 15 years old now, more or less. Just a second. We can...
All you greenhorns who wanted to see Covenant up close, this is going to be your lucky day.
So you can see the video quality is, the sort of animation quality is much less. 15 years ago, we didn't do so well.
Low-level systems online. Cracking the case in 30 seconds.
It's more obviously cartoonish. It's not actually attempting to be...
He's hot! Blowing the pins in 5! Come on, we've got to get the hell out of here!
Positions Alpha and Sierra. Center show inbound heavy
This way.
aircraft.
So that's as close to violence as we're going to get today. So it seems a little odd that this is game, right? But you're supposed to be playing this game, but in fact you're sitting passively watching it. And the fact that you have to get instructions on how to drive the game controls isn't surprising, but typically these games will alternate between cutscenes and action where you're in control throughout the game. And these pre-scripted sequences may seem a little bit odd, because after all, it's a game, you paid to play the game, right? Not to sort of watch a film. Right? But in fact, the cutscenes seem to be absolutely sort of constitutional for this particular genre. Right? They play a hugely important role in the overall, dare I say, value proposition, why people seem to like these, why they sell in the hundreds of thousands. Right? Active engagement with the main character is at the core of what seems to be a good game experience, a game experience which causes games to be well reviewed, for people to like them, to share them with their friends, and so on and so forth. And so there's a sort of interesting indeterminacy here about whether this is a game or a work of fiction, right, where you are engaged with the game because you're engaged with the character, because you care what happens to them, because you've gotten to have a sense of what or who they are. And this engagement seems to be really quite important. And the cutscenes are the way that you learn about your character. They're the way you blend, there's this sort of blend of fiction and action that the medium makes possible in a way that is novel. And that novelty hasn't worn off. Right? People still, there's still a huge market for this kind of activity. And this notion of identification, of course, isn't new. It's been a part of at least some sense of non-postmodern literature for a very long time. And the alternation between watching your character and being your character seems to actually build that sense of identification with the character very, very effectively, very strongly, very quickly. And you essentially still, and this is all third person. I'm, for better or for worse, not a player of FPSs, but I've talked to a lot of people who are since I got interested in this. And one of the things that reviews and people will tell you about what makes this thing good is that you still engage with it as a first person. It's good drama when you're in a cutscene, as well as being good action when you're actually in control. Right? So both of those things contribute to the quality of the gaming experience that makes it a good game. And it's not accidental that it's the FPSs that are like this, because you can't really do this with multiplayer games. There are too many perspectives. You can't keep all those perspectives going. The narrative they provide is the same for all their players. It's an external third-party perspective. They have an identity in that, but they're outside watching themselves, and their difference between them and the other players in the game is attenuated compared to the experience in an FPS. It's more like a team game, or I don't know, the closest I could get is something like yacht racing or distance running, where it's a team, it's a group sport, but you're an individual participating in it in a funny way. I think that they're really, I think it's legitimate. I'm not a big fan of people who aggrandize the status of everything to do with computer games as some magnificent new sign of progress on the part of the human race. But I think it's fair to say that this subgenre is something new. It's a new narrative form by merging the first person and the third person in the way that it does. And it's not, I think, an important part of that is that you typically will play this for several hours at a sitting and over a number of days before you actually get through it, right? And that means that some, at least, aspects of more traditional literary forms are showing up here, right? Character development, gain and loss, things that are completely incoherent in say, a multiplayer online game. Your character is what it is. It's not going to change. Whereas in an FPS, evolution is possible. There's time, right? Change of status, who your friends are, who your enemies are, whether you yourself are a good guy or a bad guy. All of these are labile. They can change. There's time. There's a lot of time. Right? And you may, the question of how well this is done has an impact on how much you identify with your character. I mean, it's a very clear sense, at the very least, you start out with this sense of this is your character. And the serial violence theme that is so pervasive in this space is not obviously necessary, but it does seem to be contingently dominant. And even since I wrote this slide 18 months ago for the first time, we still are waiting for the breakthrough. People still say, we're right on the edge of a whole bunch of games which are first person and narrative and engaging, but not about violence. And every once in a while, a review comes out that says such and such a new game is the breakthrough game that we've been waiting for. Not clear that it's really quite happened. And there are all kinds of questions about gender specificity here, which I'm not competent to deal with. But there have been, and continue to be, more non-violent first-person narrative games than there were back in 2013. I now want to sort of come back to the sort of ethical or philosophical dimension of this, having laid the practical groundwork, if you will, and at least briefly canvass some moral perspectives on this phenomenon. And the typical criticism that you see is something that's sometimes called habituation, right? Virtual violence habituates its practitioners to committing real violence. The lack of negative consequences in the virtual world when you commit violence contributes to that, thus making it more likely that they will commit violence in the real world. Virtually identical, as far as I can see, in terms of naivete and oversimplification, is the safety valve defense. Indulging in virtual violence allows natural aggressive impulses to be harmlessly discharged, channeled into play. That's what play is about. It's about educating our reflexes and allowing us to try out things without real consequences, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sorry, I'm not competent to pursue this, and I hope guess my tone of voice suggests that I'm skeptical of the cash value of almost all that's been written about this on either side. But I think there's a moral question here nonetheless. Consider what, at least I was taught in school about slavery, right? That slavery caused two different kinds of damage. The physical, the emotional, the existential harm to the slaves themselves, and the emotional, the moral, the spiritual damage to the slaveholders. Well, that's slightly a Western ameliorist view, but there's some truth to it, I think. And this seems to raise the moral patient question. Huh? Maybe virtual violence isn't bad because the victims aren't people. What makes slavery bad is that you're damaging real human beings. And in the case of gameplay, there's no moral question here because nobody's getting hurt. No real bodies are getting hurt. Slaves are people. We now recognize that they are, even though they weren't recognized as such in the US Constitution when it was first written. Whereas by construction, the victims of violence in a first-person shooter are non-player characters. They're not people, for sure. They may look, sound, and act like people. In fact, you may feel the quality of the game is in part expressed in the quality of the simulation, of the peopleness of the other characters. But they're not completely artificial constructs. It's not like an arcade game where you're shooting, where you have a gun, but what you're shooting are stars and ships and funny shapes and who knows what, right? But they're not avatars. There's not somebody else controlling them. Right? These are first-person shooters. You are the only actor, the only human actor in these games. Right? And it's interesting that there are two-person games. Not just the old arcade games like Pong, but actual human violence-orientated games like Street Fighter and various other forms of wrestling, boxing, judo, ultimate extreme sports, whatever you like, all right, in which there are two actors, each controlled by a separate human individual. But they very rarely actually provide a first-person perspective. In fact, virtually never, as far as I know. Right? Although you're controlling one of the characters, the view you have is the arena view, not the view out your own eyes. Well, don't know why that is. Interesting question. And I think to some extent this sort of dissolves the patiency question, right? Because there really aren't any, at least superficially so. Right? There's nobody who you can ask about, by being killed in this game, who's been killed, right? There is no entity that's been killed. Right? It's all in the imagination. Whoa, there's a gap there. I'll leave that as an exercise for the reader. Because there is disagreement about this, and I think it's worth investigating, but it's not where I want to focus for the rest of the talk. Where I want to focus for the rest of the talk is on the moral agent side. Right? And in particular, I want to focus on what has sometimes been called the first postmodern FPS, which is called Spec Ops: The Line. Anybody know it? Yeah, okay. So you'll keep me right. There's a whole book about this, right? As far as I know, it's still an online book. It hasn't been physically published, but it's a very good book. And the analogy here is a bit, I don't think this is forced. I think it's actually quite accurate. It's made by the author of the book here, that this game, Spec Ops, is very similar in the evolution of the genre to the rise of the spaghetti westerns, a sort of second-order phenomenon here, in which the artifact, whether it's the spaghetti western or the game, is both within a particular tradition, but it's at the same time inviting reflection on it. It's taking a slightly, dare I say it, postmodern stance. This is a quote from the book I mentioned, quoting somebody else. In his article, High Noon for Shooters, video game critic Michael Abbott notes that as the Western film genre matured, it turned its gaze inwards onto the Western genre itself to ask questions about the ways it depicted violence. This second wave of Western filmmakers were not necessarily trying to determine if what Western films did was good or bad. They simply wanted to create films that poked at the genre, that interrogated it, that unsettled it. And now our speaker comes back, or the author comes back and says, Abbott's point is that the bulging bubble that is video games shooter genre is heading towards a similar introspective turn. Only so many games can be absolutely uncritical and unthinking in their violence before players start to think more critically about what these games are asking of them, and developers start to question just what they are creating. I think that's a slightly optimistic viewpoint, but understandable on the part of a games critic who thinks that games are a sort of worthwhile human artifact. This is from this online analysis called Killing is Harmless by William Keogh. And he's got, I think, a very interesting analysis, and he looks at a couple of them. You know, there are a couple of major points. One of the things about FPSs is that they give the player a wide range of choices. They are the sort of, you know, the old paper book where it says at the bottom, if you open the door, go to page 12, but if you go across to the table and pick up the telephone, then go to page 6, right? Well, this is the ultimate expression of this. You can ramify the choices for as far as the developers have got the time and the money to do so. So they appear to give you a very wide range of choices about where to go, whether or not to shoot, whom to shoot, and so on. Right? But in practice, of course, you know, and the developer knows that you know, that the range of choices is limited. The game only provides a finite inventory of outcomes and a fairly wide range of immediate bad outcomes. So the reason it takes hours to play these games is you have to learn over multiple trials how to avoid the obvious but stupid next move. And then you are forced, because this is the convention, to go back to the beginning and play all the way through to that point before you get to make the choice again. And that seems to be part of the addiction engendering property of these things. In ways that I'm not sure I personally have experienced. Because you will always end up somewhere where the game wants you to go, right? There's no other way. But Spec Ops does the sort of postmodern turn on this. Right? Even though there regularly appear to be several ways forward, and they don't immediately result in your death, and reboot back to the beginning. And in some cases, at least, one of them will appear to be less distasteful than the other. The outcome ends up being the same whichever way you go. So in a particular example, which Keogh talks about, you may choose to let some non-player character go because he's American, even though he's gone rogue. He kills a hostage. He ambushes you in the next episode, and you kill him. So he's dead, hostage is dead. Right? Or you kill him right away, and somebody else kills the hostage. So you end up in exactly the same place. You can, at least in this game, I mean, it's an interesting question when the author gives you this control and where you are allowed to exercise it, you can avoid going all the way back to the beginning, because the full gameplay of Spec Ops: The Line is about a 4-hour trajectory. And if you were half an hour from the end, you really don't want to have to go back all the way to point zero and play through it again. So there are particular points at which you can revert back to where you were. And this is another quote from Keogh. The player, for as long as they choose to play the game, doesn't really make any choices that the game has not already made for them. But it nonetheless acts and delivers an environment in which you are made conscious that you are responsible for your actions because, ultimately, of the choice that you made to play the game at all. So the game designers in interviews, as well as Keogh in the book, are actually claiming that there's another important postmodern aspect to the game that they've built. Right? And this is somewhat controversial. There are people who don't agree about this, but you know, there's a claim that there's essentially a crypto-pacifist subtext here. Right? That things always go wrong because both sides are armed. Right? And there's people who don't like this game, and that's who he's referring to here. Critics don't get that depriving you of alternative ways to solve the conflict is actually the meta point of the game. It demonstrates just how inevitable violence is when either side is armed. The game is about a mindset that makes those tragedies inevitable. No one can appeal to reason and good faith when he gives himself the power to kill. Well, as I said, that's maybe you might argue, in fact, that this is parallel to some things that you may have read or that exist in the critical literature on Sergio Leone and his intellectual successors or artistic successors. I'm not sure that I think this is entirely justified. It seems a little bit too ameliorationist to me, but there's something to it. So, what is the moral agency status? What is your status as a moral agent in playing a game like this? Having made the choice to spend the money and spin up the DVD and start playing, was that the last actually interesting choice that you made? I'm not sure. This is still in the balance for me. I mean, you can't sort of play Spec Ops: The Line as a pacifist. There's not, you'd never get past the first action sequence and be sort of, have, in some sense, wasted your money. I think more so than a play, it's superficially attractive to consider the moral position of somebody playing a computer game as similar to the position of an actor in a play. But I think that's wrong, right? This is much more morally engaged than playing the bad guy in a film or a play. On the other hand, I think I think it's a little less clear to me that there's not much moral freight in identifying with a character in a book, but some. And there's at least that much here, and maybe a bit more. Because you are being an agent. Even though the agent's opportunities are scripted, by engaging in them, you're taking them on. Right? You're continuing to play. That is, as I said a minute ago, you are making the choice over and over again, not just to have opened up the package and put the DVD in the computer or done the download, but you are making the choice to continue playing. Implicitly. So there's something still going on there. Nearly done and just about on time. So in the abstract, I posed the following question. What does playing a violent video game teach its players about their own humanity? Well, the proof is in the playing, and I therefore somewhat disqualified from saying anything about this. And perhaps at least some significant portion of the audience here have not either. But I'm going to end on a personal note, nonetheless, because what started me down the road on this was actually something that my son James, previously introduced, said to me about playing this particular game. It was the first time I've ever woken up the morning after playing a game and felt dirty. Now, maybe that's just here to make Henry feel good about the fact that his son spends a lot of time playing video games, that at least he's learned a moral lesson from doing so it can't have all been entirely wasted. But I think there's actually a very deep point here, because you'll have to take my word for it that this is a reasonably thoughtful, intelligent young man, and that it's not easy to simply dismiss his interest in video games as a sign of his moral, low moral stature, shall we say. That's the closest I'm going to get to an answer to my question. I'm sure there are people in the audience with at least as much, if not much more, experience with video games, computer games, first-person shooters than I am, and I'd be very interested to hear what people have to say about this. Question about the moral status of the participants in first-person shooters or other video games, whether agent, patient, or otherwise. Thank you.